All right, and I think we should be live right now. We're live streaming in our Google Plus Hangout on the air. My name's Eric Mack. I'm the managing editor of crowdsourcing.org. We should also be live on our YouTube channel for crowdsourcing.org. And we've got with us Dory Albert of Lionbridge. And we're going to be talking today about how quality crowdsourcing is the new outsourcing. And so really briefly, before we dive into it, I want to talk a little bit, introduce Dory and Lionbridge. If you haven't heard of Lionbridge, what they do is they're one of the longest running crowdsourcing firms around there. They've been around for more than a decade. I mean, really before crowdsourcing was even a term that was coined. They're one of the few publicly traded crowdsourcing firms, and their main business for much of the more than a decade that they've been around has a lot to do with crowdsourcing translation. But in recent years, since we've gotten to know them at crowdsourcing.org, they've really been expanding rapidly into other areas. And Dory can tell us a little bit about that. And one of the things that sets Lionbridge apart from other folks in the crowdsourcing world that you've probably heard of is the fact that they focus on managed crowdsourcing for the enterprise. In this kind of enterprise crowdsourcing, the key is that it's all about higher quality. And so that is what we're going to talk about. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dory Albert of Lionbridge. If you could just kind of talk a little bit more and tell us about this managed approach for enterprises and why is quality so important?
Hi, Eric. Well, thank you for the introduction and for inviting Lionbridge to speak today. Yes, Lionbridge approaches crowdsourcing a bit different than maybe some of the other companies that you've heard about in the crowdsourcing space. Like you mentioned, Lionbridge's heritage is in the localization and translation space. We're a public company. We're about 450 million. And over 10 years ago, because of our heritage, we had to come up with new and innovative ways to deliver translation services. For any of you that know the translation or linguistic market, it's a very commoditized market, and there's heavy pressure on margins and the ability to deliver services in the most cost-efficient way. And one of the things that Lionbridge did several years ago was figure out through technology ways to bring together groups of people, typically contractors, who could deliver this type of service. And in the language service, everything is priced typically by word, which is very similar to what you'd be more familiar with in the crowdsourced task model. Because of that, we actually, with some of our more forward-thinking and high technology customers, were asked to get into what you would consider enterprise crowdsourcing, what we consider enterprise crowdsourcing, which is delivering different types of work aside from just translation in a task model. And what we realized very early on in this, and this was before the term crowdsourcing was even coined to some degree, that we were delivering outsourcing-like services with the same quality parameters that a customer would expect in an outsourcing engagement. And we've really continued that process as we've evolved our crowdsourcing practice over the past 7 to 10 years. I joined last summer, and my goal has really been to bring our crowdsourcing practice out to the rest of the market, because before that we've really grown organically within Lionbridge's current customer base to about 150 million in revenue. But this focus on quality that you mentioned is really key to all of what we deliver. We approach crowdsourcing as a managed service, which what that means is that we're looking at this from an outsourcing down perspective versus kind of this evolving crowdsourcing up. And what that means is we apply the same project management, the same service levels, the same quality parameters that you would be used to in an outsourced capacity with a offshore partner or with a BPO partner. All of our background, my background specifically, I have over 15 years in that outsourcing and BPO market, so I completely understand, as well as my colleagues do, what that is and what are those quality parameters. And that's really how we approached it from the beginning, because we had to extend our services that we were doing, which there's a great deal of quality in the translation market, as you can imagine, because you have to translate things correctly so people can read it. So being able to deliver project management, service levels, a quality approach, governance parameters. And the other thing that we find that's really key to delivering a quality product in this space is how do you recruit and manage your workers? We approach crowdsourcing with a private crowd. So we actually recruit all of our own workers. We have a crowd right now of, we say, over 100,000 workers. It's right now probably around 150,000. But we actually go and screen all of those workers before we allow them to become part of our crowd. And they're typically screened to fit for a specific type of project, meaning that when we have projects with our customers, we go and make sure that the workers that we're going to release onto that work are actually screened and have the background that they need, and they actually can perform that work, which we do through a series of online testing, as well as looking at their backgrounds and their skill sets. So having this crowd of what we call private workers is really important because we know who they are, we track their quality, and we make sure that if someone isn't performing properly, that they are no longer part of our crowd. In addition to that, we actually make sure that all of our workers are NDA'd, so they've all signed a non-disclosure. So we have less worry that this is some wild group of people that are coming in looking at our clients' data. And that's also key to our clients, to make sure that they're not uncomfortable with the workers that they're working with.
So I guess this is where the managed crowdsourcing comes in, because it's a lot different than some of the other platforms out there where a worker, a stay-at-home mom or a worker anywhere around the world can just kind of sign up and look for work or wait for the work to come in. This is more like actually managing kind of a global, geographically distributed workforce. That's what it sounds like.
Correct, absolutely. So when we look at the landscape, we kind of put it into a few buckets. Over to the left, we consider more of this contest-based work where people are really volunteering to do stuff, right? They might be volunteering to give an idea to solve a problem like the oil spill in the Gulf, or they might be, like a top coder. They might be volunteering to develop code and hope that they win, or a 99 design where they're developing a logo, and if they win, they get a cash prize. When they move up the chain from there, you get the platforms like Mechanical Turk or Odesk or Elance, where someone can actually put work out on a platform, and workers can either apply to become that worker, or they can actually just pick it up. And it's basically for the most part, a completely open forum where anyone can go in, anyone can pick up the work. There's not anyone overseeing that other than the people that actually put that work out there. Then you move up the food chain to clients that actually have their own platform, but they don't want to deal with how do you assemble and manage a crowd, because it's very difficult, as you can imagine, even with labor laws, of how to figure out how to hire all of these workers all over the globe in different countries and multilingual, and how to pay them correctly. So we actually pay all of our workers in money. We don't pay in any credits, which I know some of the platforms do. I've heard some recent ones where there's actually cell phone minutes, or there's all kinds of different models out there. But we actually pay our workers money for the work that they do on a task basis. And managing that for clients is really important. So we have some models where we work with clients where they have their own platforms that they want to use, but being able to recruit the global workforce, being able to manage them, being able to keep track of their quality, and the quality of the work returned, which is key at certain service levels, is what we do. And then moving up the food chain to what we consider a full managed service option is that we use our own platform. So Lionbridge has a proprietary platform with which our workers log into. They actually perform the work, and then we typically connect to our client systems via secure API. So the combination of recruiting and managing the crowd, having the platform to do the work on, adhering to the SLAs, providing the project management is really what makes this a managed approach.
And so, the reason that we're here is to talk a little bit about how this kind of high-quality crowdsourcing compares with more traditional outsourcing. So what's the comparison side by side for those two?
Yeah, so let me screen share quickly a infographic that we recently put up on a blog. So this will show you, can you see that, Eric?
Yes, looks great.
Okay. So I recently posted a blog to really look at this and look at this from a side-by-side comparison. So if you think about crowdsourcing compared to traditional outsourcing, outsourcing typically has, it could be multi-locations, but typically it's a single location. And I think the most prevalent, obviously, is India. So when you're working with an outsourcing provider, you're typically working with a provider that has a center or multiple centers in India in a certain location. Crowdsourcing is not limited by the walls of any specific location. We could have workers all over the globe, and in fact, in our crowd of over 100,000 workers, we have workers from over 100 countries and dozens and dozens and dozens of languages. That's very difficult to achieve when you're working with an outsourcing provider that is based on building up brick and mortar offices that they have to house people within. In addition to that, when you do have an office location with an outsourced provider, they're working in set hours, right? There's shifts. So typically in an offshore model, there's certain shifts, and they'll adjust their shifts. They might have to do 2 shifts to handle a U.S. or European work day in order to be on the same thing, but there's typically 8-hour shifts. It's pretty rigid about when those workers work and how they work. In the crowdsourcing model, it's never turned off. You know, the 9 to 5 workday is almost becoming obsolete because workers log on when they want, they complete the work when they want, and there's almost always someone online. So when you talk about 24/7 coverage, you're not trying to chase the sun by moving work from facility location to facility location. You're actually, you may have people all in one location like the US, but there's almost always someone online who wants to work at some crazy hour for whatever reason that might be. So you truly get 24/7 coverage on your work. From a flexibility standpoint, you really cannot beat the crowd model because you literally can assemble thousands and thousands of people for a project. And I will say, in our model, we actually spend quite a bit of time, like I said, qualifying people and making sure that we have an appropriate crowd ready to manage our work. So it's not something that I can turn on overnight, but once we set up a project and we have an appropriate workforce dedicated to that project, it's completely on demand, meaning that when clients put work out there, the work gets done. If there's a huge spike in the volume of that work, it can be managed through the crowd very easily. We can very easily ramp up and down. When you're working with an outsourcer, it's based on heads and people being in a facility. And in order for them to easily ramp up, they either have to pull from their bench or they actually have to go out and hire. And sometimes that can be several weeks to even months process. So the ability for a crowd model in an enterprise crowdsourcing fashion to ramp up and ramp down can't be beat. In addition to that, we have resources in multiple languages and multiple locations. So if you had work that had to get done from a location standpoint, we'll talk about some of the services later because something had to be tested in a German market, for example, you can actually do that with this type of workforce. The most powerful difference, I believe, compared to a BPO or an outsourcing model is this output-based pricing. So for any of you that have knowledge of the outsourcing space, even when there's output models in that space, it's always based on headcount. You know, I spent 15 years in this space, and there's an hourly rate associated with a headcount that builds out whatever that flat monthly bill might be. And clients know what they're going to spend over the year, but they don't know what the output is going to be for sure. In this model, we're paying the workers by task, and the clients are paying us for the work that we return back. So it's a true output-based model where clients are paying for the work that they get returned. In addition to that, and finally kind of the one last difference that I'll point out is the overhead. There's obviously a cost difference between outsourcing and crowdsourcing, and one of the reasons for that is that there's not a fixed cost of overhead. You're not dealing with facilities, you're not dealing with people being in the office, there's not a whole bunch of layers of management. While we do have our own project management, you know, you're not dealing with a whole center and a whole hierarchy of people built up within that center. In addition, from an overhead standpoint, we are working with contractors. So the contractors don't have all of the benefits, and like I said, these are people that are paid by task. So you're not dealing with employees and all of those types of issues. So you're typically looking at somewhere, against an outsourcer, depending on location, it could be anywhere between 20 and 40% cost savings.
Wow. Okay. So, I'm coming at this from a news angle. I'm a journalist, and one of the things that really catches my eye about what you guys do, specifically with Lionbridge, is some of the capabilities that you've kind of baked in that go above and beyond what we normally think of crowdsourcing. I mean, crowdsourcing kind of has some knocks against it. I mean, the general perception can be that it's low quality, and obviously this is more about high quality, and it's so high quality. And what really caught my mind my eye from a news angle is that you can go places with your crowd that most people would assume isn't even possible in terms of handling secure data. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, yeah, we found that one of the things, as you mentioned, there's this perception that it's low quality, and it's this perception, if you've seen some of the recent news, that this is about exploiting workers and paying them under maybe what they should be paid. We definitely do not approach the market like that. We actually look to pay all of our workers an equitable wage based on what the work is that we're doing, and then back that into a task model. And that really starts with kind of how this quality works. And again, all the screening in order to do that private data. But we go above and beyond that, where we actually have technology that allows us to process very secure data. So I'll give you a use case, Eric, that I think you've heard of before. One of the areas that we work in is state and local government, and we actually process for 5 state and local governments tax forms. So it's kind of timely with tax time coming right around the corner next week. But today, there's still over 32 million paper tax forms filed each year, which is hard to believe, but it still happens. And when these paper tax forms come into the state and local government, essentially they have to figure out how to get these data entered so that they can process the tax forms. And in past years, in typical markets, these state and local governments would hire temps. So it would be a huge drain on these departments of revenue to go out and hire temps at tax season that could come in and process this tax data. And it included, having to have managers who would screen them, bring them in for interviews. There's a high turnover rate in that temp market. So this was just a huge headache and very expensive for the state and local departments of revenue. So what we do for 5 state and local departments of revenue, we actually combined our crowd with a technology that allows us to manage this secure data. So how it works is we have a software module that sits behind the client's firewall, and it hooks directly to their document management system. So for those of you who are technical, things like EMC Captiva or Kofax, where the client has scanned in these images. So in this case, we're talking about paper tax forms, and then they put them into their document management platform. Our software module hooks directly to that document management platform and pulls those scanned images in. It takes a look at that image and actually cuts that image into what we call snippets, and those are snippet images of the information that needs to be captured. So in the tax form example, you're talking about first name, last name, social security number will be further broken up into smaller snippets so that there's no security risk within that. Once those forms are broken up into snippet images, they are scrambled while behind the firewall, and now at that point they can be sent over secure API to our platform. Once it comes to our platform, there's no way that even Lionbridge could put that data back together to figure out any of the secure information of the private citizens. What we do at that point is our workers log into our portal and they say, oh, there's data entry work for you, you're a qualified data entry worker, and they pull up their screen, and now they're literally given snippet by snippet the image to key in the information. Once that information is keyed in, we actually dual source it, so 2 people have to key the same thing before we accept back that data as acceptable, and that gives us 99.99% quality results. Once that has all been keyed in. We start sending it back, and now when it's in our software, it's reassembled back into that form, which is now electronic, and put back into the document management system like it never left the building. So we have ways to deal with handling, private information and sensitive information for companies so that our workers are not exposed to that. In addition, I would mention that a big differentiator, again, that I said before, is having an NDA with our workers. They are under legal obligation, of course, not to go out and do anything with any information that they have, and that's a big difference to these platforms that just stick stuff out on the web. They have to be very careful that there's nothing important or proprietary in there.
So basically, we're very lucky then to have with us you as the representative of basically the James Bond of the crowdsourcing world. So
yes.
You have that so to kind of wrap things up, tell us what are some other kind of ideal use cases for managed crowdsourcing for the enterprise. Who else might this suit?
So let me just screen share with you again. And I'll talk through really what Lionbridge does, because I think that will make sense when I talk through some of these. So Lionbridge focuses on 4 pillars of services. We have data management, testing, translation, and what we call custom crowds. So let me just take you through some of those and give you some examples, because I think that is what makes the most sense and brings it home to an understanding of what we can do. We just talked about the Department of Revenue example that we have, which is really an example of data capture. So anywhere that there's paper forms that have to be processed, another example of that is invoice processing. And the very interesting thing about invoice processing and invoices is that they're unstructured documents. So an invoice can come in a number of shapes and forms, and it's not as standard as a tax document. Our software is still capable of handling unstructured forms and masking the information so that the workers are not exposed to anything proprietary for the clients. So even in the case of unstructured forms, we can actually capture information. In the example of invoices, they have to log an invoice number so that it's now has an index for the system, but then there's also additional information that might have to be captured off of that for an ARAP department. In the data enrichment side, if you think about, for one example, information providers, that go sell information for a living, information publishers. We actually work with these types of companies to enrich their data sources that they're going and selling out to the market. And one of the big value props that Lionbridge brings in this case is our ability to source information globally in many different languages. So think about, companies that sell information on other companies. You might need to go source information on their executives, or information, that as simple as their URL and their phone number and their address. Our workers go complete records, and they're paid for completed records, and the client pays us for completed records back. In past times, they were reliant on an outsourcing provider or their own internal teams to actually hire up people globally in several different locations to try to source this data. It's very expensive for them to try to hire that themselves, and costly and time-consuming as well. Another one in this instance is, think about CRM data. We work in one case with a high-tech company, and we work on their global CRM data. And what they're looking to do is add a classification to that CRM data so that they can do more pointed and targeted marketing campaigns out to the global markets. And in order to do that, they wanted to have a very specific classification on those companies. But in order to crawl through that information, they had to have Korean speakers, they had to have Chinese speakers, they had to have French, German, it's over 20 languages to go through and add this classification so that they could do more pointed and targeted marketing, and also provide their sales team with more accurate information. In the big data space, this is a really big area for us. For those of you that know big data at all, there's a lot of technology out there. There's all the buzz these days, and a lot of companies are implementing large architectures in order to process big data. And what that means is they're going out to the internet, they're scraping a lot of unstructured content, and what comes back is not in a medium that it's very easy to do any real analytics on. And there's still some sort of human intervention that has to go in order to make that in the right format and have the right information in order to achieve the analytics that they're trying to get, which typically is tied to basically upselling their products in most cases. So what we can do is we actually have so many workers that can go in on a task basis and crawl through this information, whether it means cleansing it, deduplicating records, transforming the data from video or audio, transcribing it into digital format, capturing the information off of images, and getting it into a single format that companies can do data processing on. One example I'll give you, Eric, if you've ever heard of sentiment analysis and a company called Radian6 that really goes out and provides a sentiment rating on information for companies so that they can keep track of the information that they have out there and whether it's positive or negative sentiment. One of the challenges with that type of software is that it's software, and it can only give a sentiment rating based on whatever the program has been programmed. So it typically looks for positive and negative words, but it's a machine. It can't detect things like sarcasm. And typically companies want to go a little deeper than that if they're very interested in keeping track of their sentiment. And there's a number of parameters that they want to rank that on. If it's a life sciences company, maybe they want to know if there was something negative related to a drug interaction because they want to flag that. What our workers can do is crawl through millions and millions of records that can come across even on a daily basis and apply a specific parameter to that record so that the client can actually do better analytics on that and dig into why is there negative information out there about me, beyond just is it negative. So that's one example. In the testing space, over here, what we really do is we call it in-country testing, and that's our ability to gather a crowd in over 100 countries to test something out. So it might be a mobile device, it might be a tablet, it might be some other sort of hardware, software, it might be a website, it might be a mobile app. We really target, like everything else, the enterprise that has ongoing needs. So if you can think of some of the very large device manufacturers, we work with some of them to test out their new devices. We even test to make sure that they have a signal in certain locations, that they can do transactions on that device. But in order for them to be able to assemble people all over the world to do this test, it's a logistical nightmare, and it's very expensive for them. So this is a great alternative for that. In the translation space, one of the areas that's important, and of course Linebridge is a translation company, so we offer a number of translation services, including professional translation. But one of the growing in popularity offerings that we have in the translation space is around using bilingual or native speakers to do translation rather than professional translators, because everything doesn't need to be professionally translated. You can use a native speaker to translate certain types of content, such as what we use in this example is user-generated content. So there was a very interesting Forrester report that came out 2 weeks ago that talked about influencing buying behaviors. And what this report was about was what are the things that actually influence buyers. And the first number one thing was recommendations from friends or family. The second thing was a professional recommendations from a CNET or one of those professional organizations. And the third thing was product reviews or user reviews. So if you think about, I know for myself, when I go and buy anything online, I always read the product reviews. And so a use case in this, for example, we work with one of the largest online travel companies, and they were looking for cost-effective ways to translate their travel reviews into other languages so they could start driving more business and traffic in those locales to other markets. And so we translate their travel reviews. And one of the benefits of using a native speaker, a bilingual speaker in that case, is that you're keeping the sentiment of that original review, and you're not using a professional that now makes it look like marketing basically came in and doctored it up. So you can do translations at much less expensive and actually get things translated that wasn't possible before using professionals. And
how do you measure? I'm sorry, but how do you measure quality when you're talking about translations in other languages?
So there's, I mean, we basically come up and customize that on a client-by-client basis of how they're going to measure quality. I mean, there's professional translation, right? We look at a quality pyramid such as professional translators are at the top, and that's, any marketing content or user manual or something that definitely needs professional translators, you would use that. The next level down for us would be MT post edit. So you use machine translation and you post edit it with professional translators. That's kind of the second level quality. The third is machine translation with, well, actually, the third would be native speakers, or what I'm saying, bilingual people. And then the lowest level would really be pure MT. So it's kind of a quality pyramid, and then the actual specific service levels or parameters that we do is on a project-by-project basis. Make sense?
And also, Lauren, I see your question, and the webinar will be available. We'll be embedding it on crowdsourcing.org, since I see you missed the beginning.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
So the last area, Eric, and then I think that's what I'll cover. But is the custom crowd, and the custom crowd is really our ability to customize a solution for a customer. And this is really an area where you're talking about, rather than having a different sourcing type solution, whether it's outsourcing or temp sourcing or whatever that sourcing might be, or BPO, but it's more ongoing work that a client needs, that we're going to take time to really recruit and hire very specific skills that they're going to need on an ongoing basis. But the work actually fluctuates, meaning that they don't need people 40 hours a week every day. They might need someone 10 hours one week, or the group of people 10 hours one week, and the next week they need 80 hours of tons of people. An example I'll give of that is for one of our high-tech customers who sell a large ERP system. They needed to keep track of tax law changes in a number of markets. And what we did is we assembled a crowd of CPAs in 25 global markets to monitor for tax law changes in those local markets. And when there was a tax law change, they actually logged that in, and that was their task. And then that actually went to a second custom crowd that we developed for them, that was a crowd of systems analysts that knew this ERP product. It's a very large customer of ours. And they would write a system document that would basically capture that tax law change and what technical changes were going to have to go into the technical system. And that system document was then sent to the customer's own internal development team. So a very specific requirement that they had that was ongoing, that we were able to provide a custom crowd solution for them.
All right.
Before we go, can I ask you one question? Sorry.
Sure.
So I'm really interested to know, for these custom crowd solutions, what is your traditional ramp time for a large client?
It depends, of course, like anything else, it depends. But it takes time. I mean, we don't set these up overnight. If you're talking about something in this case where you're talking about CPAs in 25 global markets, it could take us, a month to 6 weeks to set something like that up. If it's something that, that we have more experience in and we're already doing, it might be less, more like 2 to 4 weeks. But again, it really depends how specialized it is, how big it is that we might need to. I mean, we have projects where we have to run thousands and thousands of people, and that takes time to get all of that in place. But you're still talking less than 2 months to get these things up and running, even in a very, very large scale.
Great, thank you.
I think
I had also a question. Yeah, sorry, I'm from Spain. I'm doing research about crowdsourcing. So I had one concrete question about how Lionbridge manage all the users that do this work, in terms that you are like privately contracting these users. So where's the crowd in terms if not everyone can access the platform, then you're not really using crowdsourcing for your own platform.
I'm not sure I understand the question exactly. All of our workers actually have to be able to get to our platform. If it's work on our platform, or if it's a client's platform, they have to be able to get to the platform in order to be able to deliver that work. Does that make sense?
Does anyone can work on Lionbridge, or you have to have some skills before you
Correct.
do any recruiting? Okay.
That's correct. We actually go through a pretty heavy screening process before we release anyone into our crowd, and it's typically on a project-by-project basis.
Okay, thanks.
So that's just it's a more formalized process of, like, with Mechanical Turk or some other platforms that are out there. You kind of get graded and scored, and you get feedback, as you go. You guys are just cutting that process out and doing it in the beginning before you add those people to your crowd.
Correct. So, we have thousands and thousands of what we call expressions of interest every month, and some months we can only bring a couple hundred people into the crowd, depending on what the workflow and the ramp is at that point. So we basically communicate with our workers that here's the projects that we're hiring for today, and they go through an application process just like they would for any other type of contracting work. And once their resume and all that is screened, we have a group of recruiters that look at that. Then they may go through to a second phase, which is online testing. So some of our projects have very rigorous online testing that these workers have to go through, which could be hours of testing, which they do on their own time, and they have to hit a certain quality score to then be actually released into the crowd. It depends on what the work is, of how complicated that testing might be, but they all generally go through a screening process and then an additional level of testing before they're released into the crowd.
All right. Any other questions from anyone else on the Hangout? All right. I think that about does it. Dory, anything else you wanted to cover before we sign off?
The only thing I would mention is that we are hosting a webinar next week on the 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern with your own Carl Esposti from crowdsource.org, as well as the CEO from Sourcing Interest Groups, Dawn Evans, to talk more about crowdsourcing, about the crowdsourcing industry in general, and then again talking in more detail about this whole managed crowdsourcing approach and how that goes. So if anyone can join us, that'd be great.
Right, and there's some more information on that webinar on crowdsourcing.org. Actually, that infographic that you shared earlier, we've also got that up on the site. And then this, I'll be embedding this also on the site, the entire discussion here, so that'll go up as well. So,
just for some other additional information, Eric, sorry, you can certainly visit lionbridge.com, but we also have our own microsite called thesmartcrowd.com, which has some of our case studies and a few videos and some other things for additional information. Thank you.
All right, there you go. Lionbridge.com, crowdsourcing.org. Those are the two places to get all the information. And I want to thank everyone. What's funny is I actually didn't mean to put the link up that allowed everyone to join the Hangout, but I'm glad I did, because then we got some actual interaction and some questions. And so thanks everyone for participating. And I'm going to go ahead and sign off right now. Again, I'm Eric Mack from crowdsourcing.org, Dory Albert from Lionbridge, and check both of those sites for more information.
Thank you.
Go ahead and